Okay, for this installment of Current Reflections on Building Infrastructure, we are joined by longtime Tribal College leader Jim Shanley. Dr. Shanley is a member of the Fort Peck, Assiniboine, and Sioux tribes and began his service as an administrator at United Tribes Technical College, where he served as academic dean. He was later recruited as president of Standing Rock Community College, now Sitting Bull College. Eventually, he returned home where he served as president of Fort Peck Community College for over 28 years. An early leader and organizer in the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, Dr. Shanley helped shepherd the landmark Tribally Controlled Community Colleges Act through Congress and into law. He also helped found the American Indian College Fund. So thanks for joining us, Dr. Shanley.
My pleasure.
Your name often comes up at AHAC conferences, so I'm sure that tribal college leaders, both young and old, will be pleased to hear from you. So over the years, you witnessed tremendous change in tribal college infrastructure. Can you tell us a little bit about tribal college infrastructure in the 1970s?
Yes, I've been thinking about this a little bit. What a person needs to remember is that tribal colleges, there are different types of tribal colleges. And prior to the modern arrangement back in the 1960s, well, starting actually back into the 30s and 40s, the federal government built institutions to educate American Indians. And they started with Haskell being probably the major one, and it was started as a high school and eventually kind of blossomed into a community college, a two-year college. Eventually, of course, it became the Haskell that's around today. But in the early 1970s, there were three federal schools. And by federal schools, I mean government-run schools. It was Haskell, SIPI, and the Art Institute. Now, over the years, they changed their funding models a little bit, but the thing was with the government-run schools, the government provided the infrastructure. They actually came in and built buildings and maintain those buildings. The United Tribes, when it came about, was an old Army fort, as was DQU down in California. That was an old radar site. And those things, Indians were able to get a hold of them in the late 60s and early 70s and convert those. But the tribal colleges that were reservation-based were basically a whole different creature. And they started with zero infrastructures. And probably the pervading thought, and this is very important, because this goes right to the heart of what tribal colleges are and what they represent. What they represented at that time was a whole group of young American Indian people that were getting out of graduate school and college, and for the first time could see a way to try to bring some freedom to their tribes and to their reservations. And they thought that freedom, they're very confident that American Indian people were smart. And they thought that if they could offer an opportunity for people to improve their lives, that people would take those opportunities, irregardless of whether it had to be done in an old shed with 3 or 4 beat up chairs, or whether it was being done in a modern classroom. The infrastructure was not the major thing. The major thing was this idea that Indian people could control their own destiny by helping to educate their people. And I think that that's a very important type of consideration. Many years later, of course, that changed. Does that help to explain it a little bit?
Yeah. What were some of the biggest challenges as far as infrastructure is concerned that you faced?
Well, tribes for those categories of tribal colleges that were located on the reservation, tribes generally had access to land, and so land is not a problem, but the buildings, tribal buildings, were they were usually inherited old Bureau of Indian Affairs buildings of some type or another. And so in many cases, they were very, very old. If the college could get a hold of a building, they would do their best to renovate them and keep them going. I think there are several people that really deserve recognition for developing models that work to help with the infrastructures. In the early years, after the formation of Salish Kootenai College, Joe McDonald hired some very aggressive building tradespeople, and they started building all of their own things. And prior to that, that didn't happen very much. And as the other tribal colleges saw Salish, it became a common model where they were building their own infrastructure. Now, they also did that at United Tribes, and United Tribes was maybe the first example of it, I should say, because the United Tribes had a building trades program, and they used a building trades program to build housing for their students. But they were, again, off reservation. So that's kind of the way that it started. And then after that point, when AHEC, the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, became more organized, eventually we started the American Indian College Fund. And when we started the American Indian College Fund and moved into that nonprofit arena, we started to attract the attention of various philanthropic entities around the country, foundations and private givers. And so some of those people really saw the need, and they came in and started adding to the amounts of money that reservation-based tribal colleges had for infrastructure, and we were able to start to build some very nice campuses, and that existed for a number of years. And then we were able, because we had support from the private sector, convince the federal people to add additional money, and we started getting federal money that could be used for infrastructure. So it was a long process, and it varies somewhat historically for each individual tribal college, but that's generally the way that it occurred. I'm not so sure that it could happen again today.
So what do you see today as being the greatest obstacles and the greatest need as far as infrastructure goes at tribal colleges?
Well, it's very difficult to make a prediction about what kind of government support tribal colleges are going to receive. I would say that for the most part, tribal governments are much better off now than they were in the early days of the tribal colleges. And some tribal governments are very, very stable and have generated substantial streams of revenue. So I think that in some instances, some tribal colleges will be able to expect their tribes to contribute to infrastructure, both land and buildings. The federal government, it's very difficult to say what's going to happen with with our current problems that we have with the feds. I know that AHEC has been working diligently to try to maintain some of the resources that exist right now, but it's going to vary from administration to administration and from Congress to Congress. Our support has never ever been really administration based. It's always been more congressionally based. And when you get a Congress that is for years and years becomes polarized, between the two political parties, it's really difficult to move forward and try to solve problems. And I think our whole country reflects that. But so what's going to happen in the future, I don't know. There is always the possibility of sporadic input from the philanthropic area, from foundations and from private individuals. And then I think that if tribal colleges are following a sound financial model, they should be able to generate some of their own building funds too, and still continue to use that we'll build it ourselves model as well. Does that help to answer that question?
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I know that some tribal college leaders have expressed concern about new tribal colleges and how the pool of funding just keeps getting smaller. As a longtime tribal college leader who has seen many changes in the movement over the past 4 decades, do you have any insights to share regarding this concern?
Well, I would tell them to shape up. The thing is, we've had like 20 years now of fairly stable operational funding. And for people that are running into, for individual colleges that are running into problems because of a dip in their 471 monies, I would have to say, hey, you need to look at your financial models because you should have anticipated and you should have set up mechanisms to help deal with this. If you take some of the more successful tribal colleges around, and I'll give you one example of a reservation-based model. That's Ogallala Lakota College. Well, Tom Shortbull has put in a very effective financial model into Ogallala, and he has things planned out so that he can survive almost any waves in the ocean for probably the next 20 years. And there's no reason that most of the tribal colleges couldn't do that. What tends to happen is that when people deal with federal funds, they get into a federal funding mentality, and that mentality is based on fiscal periods. Because you'll get a federal grant that says, we're going to give you X amount of money for 1 year. And at the end of that year, you have to have it spent. So they take that mentality and they apply it to all of their resources. So they try to spend all of their money every year down to the penny. And consequently, they waste a lot of their money. They don't have reserve accounts. They have no savings or no protective kinds of elements built into their financial systems, and because tribal programs generally operate the same way and they're living in the same environment, they don't see anything wrong with it. So I don't have too much sympathy. We've had 20 years to correct this and to put these kinds of operations into place, and a lot of people haven't done it. And they need to start doing it, or they're going to run into real financial problems.
Okay. Well, today, just building on what you just said, some TCUs do continue to struggle, and especially with infrastructural development more than others. Do you have any advice on how TCUs can better work together to improve infrastructure for all?
Well, I think that there's a whole. I've got some theories about it. You know, I mean, we can come up with very clever formulas on how to proceed, but you always have to go back to the basics. And let me explain or use this story to illustrate that. Years ago, tribal colleges had a chance to get involved with satellite programs. And at that time, this was before the invention of iPhones. We were just coming into the internet period where you had interconnectivity between computers. But we set up a pilot program, and 5 or 6 colleges uplinked to satellite and delivered courses to other tribal colleges. Well, that worked for about 3 years, and it was financially unmanageable because it cost too much for the satellite linkage. But we didn't ask the basic question then about who we were going to serve, why we were going to serve them, and how much it was going to cost. And I think we have to use those basic questions. Now, what happened after that, of course, is the ground-based, the internet superseded all of the satellite transmission thoughts because it was so cheap. And we're at the point now where through the internet, you can deliver, 85% of all of the educational services that an institution can offer. Which brings us to the next point. The next point is that there is and has been, and we're in the middle of, a very rapid and very massive change in the way we view education. Handheld objects, the iPhone, has changed the ball game. And all of education, not only tribal colleges, all the way up to the biggest universities, are going to have to look at their educational models, the way they collect, collate, and distribute information, the way they teach problem solving, and the way they teach a whole number of other things. And we're in the middle of this change right now. So what happens when somebody can be out riding horseback and use their iPhone to connect to a class? It makes the infrastructure less important in terms of buildings. Now, in terms of infrastructure, you have some general types of educational buildings. You have your typical classrooms, and then you have vocational classrooms, which again are more expensive and more dedicated to specific things. And then now we have whole areas for science and technology. But what's going to be important going into the future, because of the entire shift taking place in education, is the technology end of it. I mean, we're seeing such advances so fast. It's mind-boggling. We're going to have artificial intelligence on an operational level probably within the next 10 years. and how does that impact, infrastructure, for example? I don't know. I don't have the answer to it, but I sure have the question.
Yeah, it's fascinating what's coming down the pipeline, that's for sure. Well, let me just conclude with this final question. What advice do you have for new tribal colleges as far as infrastructure and how these new tribal colleges, in many ways, they're reflective of the TCUs in the 1970s. What advice do you have for them, and how can they develop infrastructure more efficiently and effectively?
Well, again, I think that the first thing that you do is you don't make expensive mistakes. So you have to look at building finance models, and like I would advise people to look at the way that Ogallala Lakota College is structured, or somewhere in Fort Peck Community College, or Salish, and how they handle their finances. And so you have a financial model that's flexible and works. And then secondly, start asking those basic questions. Who are we going to serve? Why are we going to serve them? At what cost do we serve them? Do we involve other people in terms of delivering these services? For example, other institutions? How can we make this work most effectively and efficiently for our people at home? And it's those basic questions, and that's what comes down to the technology as well. There needs to be a technology plan, and there needs to be thinking on a regular basis as to what happens if in 2 years this stuff is no longer relevant because our technology is superseding it. So I would say asking those basic questions is really the most important thing that any group of people can do.
Great.
Does that help?
Yes, very, very much so. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Shanley, for joining us today.
Okay, well, thank you, Brad, and have a good year.
Okay, take care.
All right.
Bye.